lyrics from Topeka. Kevin Young, Ed Skoog, Cyrus Consul, who I think is a brilliant writer, who also apparently that's the name of the joystick, the Cyrus Consul. But he's a great poet. His book is called Brief Underwater. Eric McHenry, who has a book called, a book out from Way Wiser Press. So there's something in the water that produces poets, for better or worse. That's a very inarticulate way of saying I have no idea what it was like growing up in Kansas, since it's the only place I grew up in. But my parents and many of my best friends are still there, and I go back and enjoy going back. But you know, it's always like wherever you're from, it's some kind of mixture of trauma and desire.
In Angle of Yaw, I spent a lot of time trying to make interpretations for content and the word choices. I believe it's on page 57, along the ends with the exclamation audibly. I was wondering if that's like a sympathetic or empathetic statement, or perhaps maybe like an antithetical play on words for the ending of Melville's story. I'm just interested in your take, like what the director's purpose was.
Yeah, I mean that's a great, it's a great story. It's one of my favorites, and I'm kind of interested throughout that book, and maybe in the other books also, in thinking about kind of figures of heroic negativity, right? Like instead of the kind of cult of affirmation, the kind of yes to everything, that on the one hand we think of as really positive thinking, but also like robs us of our critical power and our capacity to imagine alternatives to whatever the status quo is. Like I'm really interested in the no, right? And in figures of negation. And I mean, he's one of the great ones, right? And highly ambiguous ones. But so he kind of shows up in a few different places, most explicitly there, as kind of the archetype of this hero of negativity. But the word no is kind of all over the book.
From an angle, we always see a kind of like a sense of antagonism towards, I don't want to say technology, but like the way people are passive with technology, I guess, nowadays. So, and like we were talking about as a class, and we kind of think that this sense of antagonism is found in like values of older generations, and you're a young writer, so can you tell me about like your view of this, or how you think you were shaped like that?
It's a really good question. I mean, I don't know if it's, I think that it's easy to kind of naturalize previous generations of technology. Like it's easy to forget that like writing, by hand on a piece of paper is just as technological in an important way as like texting on your iPhone, right? In the sense that there's always mechanical mediation and a material history, to the conditions that produce that particular, activity. So to a certain degree, I want to say that kind of the technology, the novelty of technology is one of technology's oldest claims, right? And to a certain degree, what's wrong with like the older generation that just says, oh, like kids today are always on their phones or playing video games. So there was always some other technology, right? Like that's a nostalgia for this immediacy that's always mythological. And for me, what's difficult intellectually is trying to balance that awareness with like the sense that these new technologies really do alter the structure of our experience in some other way, right? And like that kind of like workshop cliche, write what you know. Like I wanted to think about what it would mean. I mean, what I know is in large part. I mean, who doesn't know like the Super Mario Brothers theme song or something? Like, no one I know doesn't know that. So it's this kind of, like it or not, it's a cultural framework in common for a lot of Americans. For me, I was interested in that book in particular, how kind of like technologies of viewing have political content, right? Like the way that, if you show Saddam Hussein's face enough times next to the image of the towers collapsing, that will produce a sense that Saddam Hussein was behind the attacks on the World Trade Centers, no matter what the voiceover says. And they could report long after, right, even like the CIA reports that said there was no link between September 11th and the invasion of Iraq were out, like, a huge portion of Americans still reported that, they thought it had been proved, that the contrary had been proven. And in part, that's a question not of a lack of information, but of the very effective kind of information that's projected through the juxtaposition of images, right? And so the dominance of the image in contemporary culture and the dominance of the image and kind of my experience within contemporary culture is a theme of that book, which, in part came out of a lot of outrage for what I experienced as the bankruptcy of mass culture when it came to trying to deal with questions of mass politics. So I don't know. I mean, I'm not at all. I don't think that like there's some alternative to technology, and I believe like insofar as we'll survive as a culture, right, that it'll be about the utilization and development of technology. And I'm not interested in any kind of like reactionary technological fantasy, but I am interested in being able to have an art that can take the measure of how those changes in technology restructure our experience of our relationships to each other. I don't know is really the answer, but that's a very nice question. Yeah.
In Angle of VR, you're full of references to God looking down on masses of people. And in the one poem that you read, there's the reader looking down as symbolizing shame and embarrassment. Is there a connection? How does that put the reader in juxtaposition with God, or how can that come together?
Yeah, that's a really nice observation. I mean, in part, maybe reading there, I mean, my kind of like interpretation of this doesn't have any more authority than yours. Like, in part, I think that their reading is a scene of humility as opposed to the kind of hubris of the Goodyear blimp, like, projecting our image as a crowd onto the Jumbotron, right? Like, there's something solitary and personal about that. It's almost like a shame at the mass culture, right? That's produced in that solitary act of reading. I mean, that would be one way to distinguish how that looking down isn't godlike, right? Whereas some of the other technologies of viewing are all about replacing the vantage point of a deity with the camera. But more generally, the book is interested in, as like you really eloquently point out, right, in like how posture and different